Hi, my name is Jonathan Zemsky, and I am the author of Beyond the Shadows of Summer. Before I begin reading Chapter 10, I wanted to remind you all that this book is recommended for ages 10 or 11 plus, has some themes of teen sexuality and language, and has some strong themes of loss and death, with lots of fun and uplifting stuff in between. Chapter 10, The Ball Drops. I was riding such a high all day long that I forgot my life was still in danger. Then, Black Eye and his posse stopped by for a cone. They decided not to pay, and between me, G-Man, and Alex, we sure weren't going to ask them to. "Oh, looky there," Black Eye said, pointing to my swollen eye. "Hey, I didn't do that, unless just thinking about doing it made it appear. Now that would be a first." I said nothing, hoping he would forget the whole idea after seeing I had already been hurt. "Listen, punk," he said, leaning in so far that I could see his straggly nose hairs. "Don't think that you've escaped your punishment. I'd never leave a mark as light as that one on your eye." The posse chuckled behind him. "That'd be an embarrassment," Black Eye continued. "No, you're gonna feel my punch for years. Your day is coming," he said, with an intense stare, strong enough to make most people wet their pants. I barely heard him. I was staring right past him into another world, the world of Paige. "Come on, man. Are you going to order or what?" asked a large man who was standing behind Black Eye and his posse. The line had lengthened substantially during our exchange. "We're out of here," Black Eye said to his posse, "and you're a dead man," he said to me before leaving. Or at least that's what G-Man told me Black Eye had said when I was hypnotized. I shuddered and realized I would be a dead man by the end of the fair, if not sooner. Our shift ended and we were off to the ball field for the annual softball game organized by our boss, Mr. Curran. Each year he recruited his employees and challenged Mr. Swift, the owner of Simply Beef, and many of the corn dog stands at the fair, to a softball game. It was a tremendous deal to both elderly men and for many of the townspeople. Each man had a ton of friends and family who went to the games to show support. Many of them were old high school buddies. The winner earned bragging rights for the year and either a dozen corn dogs or a dozen cones. The funniest thing about the game was that both Mr. Curran and Mr. Swift insisted on playing. Each was 75 years old. To understand the birth of this softball tradition, you have to go back 60 years when Mr. Curran and Mr. Swift used to battle against each other in high school baseball. Mr. Curran played for Jefferson High, and Mr. Swift played for Lincoln High. Each was the star shortstop for his team, two of the best players in the area at the time. They split their high school games, each team winning 4 games over a 4-year period. Neither man would admit to the other being a better player. They argued about it constantly, often grabbing former teammates, classmates, and even some innocent bystanders to help plead their case. Years went by until the two proud men had the chance to once again battle it out. It was for the king of the snack stands. Whichever man earned the most sales at the fair wore the crown. Again, they were even, alternating nearly every year. During the really hot summers, Mr. Curran would win ice cream over corn dogs. Other years, the results were reversed. Their most heated battles always came back to baseball, however. They played softball now because of their age, but the fire was still burning in them like it was 60 years ago. To them, they were still 15 years old. Although it was always billed as a friendly competition, some felt that Mr. Swift and Mr. Curran hired workers based only on their ball-playing abilities. It didn't surprise me when Mr. Curran asked my parents at church if G-Man and I would work for him. Many people knew we were two of the best ball players in the county. Mr. Curran occasionally stopped by Chapman Field to watch us play. It was like he was scouting us for a big league team. Only he hadn't seen me play in a year. My glove had been locked in my trunk since Brand died. The 30-year-old long series between the corn doggers and the dairy mooers was, of course, tied at 15-15. The previous year, Mr. Curran had tied up the series with a win on a controversial call. Mr. Swift referred to the call as a clear misrepresentation of the truth, while Mr. Curran called it an act of God. The play went like this. The corn dogger had hit a ball that landed either on the foul line or very close to it. Mr. Swift's keen eyesight told him that it was clearly fair. He argued with the ump for 10 minutes before returning to the bench. Each manager liked to argue at least one call so they had an excuse to fall back on if they lost the game. That's right, there was even an umpire. The series became so big and so important that they had to hire one. That honor was bestowed upon Sheriff Scott, a well-respected man who had served in the town's law enforcement for over 15 years. His 6'2", 200-plus pound frame was enough to keep most people, especially us kids, in line. He would threaten both team captains, good-naturedly, with his billy club when they got out of line. Another interesting aspect of the games was that they were co-ed. The two captains didn't have enough boys working for them to field a complete team, so they asked the girls to play as well. Some of them were pretty good too. Almost all of them were better than Costello, or as he was known on the ball field as Seven Thumbs Sally. Since this was our first year working at the fair, it was also our first chance to play in the big game. Fizz and Costello were on Mr. Swift's team, and G-Man and I were on Mr. Curran's. I thought we had a definite edge, except for one problem. I wasn't going to play. I felt like I was letting my team down, but it wasn't enough to get me into the lineup. Mr. Curran had offered me everything from a pay raise to a 5-cone-a-day bonus to entice me to play. I kindly refused. He eventually seemed to lose interest. The impending game brought a series of thoughts into my mind. If Brand and I hadn't played ball that day and he hadn't gotten hit in the chest and he had just stayed home and rested, maybe he would still be with me. I now hated baseball, despised the game. The thought of playing it made me sick. G-Man and I greeted Fizz and Costello when we arrived at Chapman Field. The grounds looked perfect as usual. Bert must have laid out fresh chalk before heading over to the fair to work in the stables. I felt strange about returning to Chapman Field after a whole year. I walked way around the infield. I didn't want any painful memories kicked up from the dirt to my brain. Can I change your mind? G-Man asked me. My mind doesn't need changing, I gruffly replied. I saw G-Man's eyes drop and softened my tone. You guys don't need me anyway. Go get 'em, man. I headed over to take my spot on the bleachers, Brand's sketch pad at my feet. I put my elbows on my knees and my hands under my chin and thought about how I got to this place in my life. My head slipped off my hands when I saw Paige walking through the trees with Millie. I had totally forgotten Paige and Millie worked for Mr. Swift and would therefore be playing against our team today. Paige looked amazing, wearing shorts and an orange ball cap that had the word fly stitched into the front. Her legs were lean and strong. I couldn't tear my eyes from her as she approached. Millie looked as awkward as Paige looked stunning. She was too tall for her body and had a plastic blue glove that looked like it was meant for a 5-year-old. Alex Pample was the next to arrive. Mr. Curran had no chance of winning with this guy playing. G-Man had tried to confuse Alex by giving him the wrong time for the game, but obviously that hadn't worked. If you wanted to win something, you didn't want Pample on your side. Of course, none of us had ever seen him play, but we could just tell by looking at him he was bad news on a baseball field. Alex was wearing a Brooklyn Dodgers cap and a shirt that had the name Robinson written on the back. Jackie Robinson was one of my favorite players. My dad had told me many times Jackie Robinson's story, that he was the first black man ever to play in the major leagues, and how he had to put up with tons of racist comments, opponents, and even fans. He was an awesome player, a great hitter, fast runner, and possessed lightning-quick hands in the field. I wasn't happy that Alex was about to disgrace Jackie's name by stinking up the joint with his jersey on. "Play ball!" Sheriff Scott shouted, snapping me from my thought. Game time. The Dairy Mooers took the field first. I watched Alex have a brief discussion with Mr. Curran, who was trying to send him out to play left field. Alex argued his way over to second base, Robinson's position. Mr. Curran took left field instead. Excuse me. The first kid up grounded to short, and the second one popped out to the first baseman for 2 quick outs. This kid, Doug, who was as big as a tree, stepped up to bat next and slugged a solo home run over the fence and left. The following kid popped out to the catcher. Inning over. No balls were hit to Alex in the first inning. Our team had escaped disaster. I couldn't tell you what happened in the bottom of the first inning because I didn't catch a single swing. I was too busy staring at Paige out in right field. I think I only blinked once, and that was when she ran into the gap to catch a fly ball. She moved like a cheetah. She caught the ball in stride and threw to second base on a fly. Everyone was staring at her, and many were cheering. The people of Springfield had never witnessed a girl who could play ball this well. Top of the second, and everyone on the Moors held their breath as Alex saw his first grounder of the day. It was hit straight at him. He calmly scooped it up and fired it to first. Mr. Curran, who had been hiding behind his glove with fear, wore a surprised look on his face. "Way to go, Alex," he clapped. I heard someone else yell it too and realized that it was me. I sat back down. The next inning, Alex continued to surprise everyone when he delivered a base hit to the gap in left field. His hit drove in G-Man from third, who had singled earlier in the inning. Alex kept running like a bullet and stretched it into a double, diving headfirst into second base, just under the tag. The crowd erupted as Alex stood up, nose running but smiling, and dusted himself off. And so they played. A rocket of a hit by G-Man, another great play by Paige, and some steady fielding by Alex. For the next 2 hours, the people of Springfield were treated to a modern classic. The score was 6-4, our favor, in the final inning. The sun was now halfway visible above the horizon, making it difficult to follow the path of the ball. It was then that Jeffrey Thomas, who was playing shortstop, my position, had to reach for a hard-hit ball. Jeffrey, who was a pretty good fielder, planted his foot awkwardly when the ball suddenly took a funny bounce and changed direction. As his body twisted to compensate, his ankle gave out and he fell over onto the outfield grass in pain. Several people rushed out to help him while the rest of us looked on. Jeffrey, fighting back tears, was carried off the field by his dad and his uncle. He was out of the game. Mr. Curran immediately looked up to find me in the stands. "Hey, James! We need ya!" he called out. I ignored him for a second, hoping he would get the hint, and asked somebody else. "Come on, James!" he yelled louder, and the whole crowd turned to face me. I felt their eyes on me, but mine were focused on Paige. She too was staring at me, or right through me, it seemed. She wore a reassuring smile, and her gaze was full of hope. She was nodding her head. I stood up, brand sketchpad in my hand, and headed down the steps of the bleachers. The crowd cheered, and I took a quick left turn and ran into the trees. The cheers turned to a confused murmur. I heard some people asking questions as I left the field. "Where's he going? Isn't that the Sayer boy? What's he doing? We need him." G-Man stopped by my house later that evening and told me the Corn Dogger scored 2 more runs to tie the score because we were short a fielder. He said the game was suspended due to darkness and slated to be completed at the end of the fair. Sheriff Scott tried to declare the game a tie, but the 2 old managers wouldn't have it. They argued with the umpire before verbally going at each other, each man pointing a finger at the other, blaming him for intentionally slowing the game and therefore causing the postponement. G-Man said he had never heard anything like it, one man placing blame on another for allowing the sun to fall. The sheriff had to break them up, as usual. As for me, I had embarrassed myself in front of the whole town, my friends, and worst of all, Paige.